Hi viewers, today in Botany online classroom we are going to discuss about transpiration. The learning objectives are introduction to transpiration, to understand stomatal structure, to know stomatal movement mechanism, and also to understand about the factors which influence the stomatal movement. So what is transpiration? Now the transpiration is the process of water movement through a plant and its evaporation from aerial parts such as leaves, stems and flowers. Now in the below picture we see water is absorbed by the plant through the roots. So the absorbed water is transported to the aerial parts like stem, leaves, branches through the xylem of the plant parts. So now we see water is absorbed by the roots here and it is ascended through the stem. This is also called ascent of sap and this water travels through the stem into the branches and leaves. Finally, the excess water is evaporated into the atmosphere. So this is called as transpiration. So there are three types of the transpiration. First one is called stomatal transpiration. Second one is called cuticular. Third one is called lenticular. So if the evaporation of the water takes place through the stomata of the leaves, then it is called as stomatal transpiration. So mostly around 80 to 95% of the transpiration takes place through the stomata of the leaves. And also the transpiration occurs through the cuticle on the leaves. So this around for 5 to 10% of transpiration occurs through the cuticle of the leaves and also cuticle of the young stems. And third one is called lenticular transpiration. So this transpiration occurs through the lenticels of the stem. So we can see some of the lenticels which are present in the bark of the stem. In the larger trees, we can find the lenticels on the stem bark and also on the fruits. So this accounts for 1 to 2% in the total transpiration. So majority, the stomatal transpiration dominate. Other so this stomatal transpiration is 80 to 95%. So now we are going to see the structure of the stomata. So evaporation of the water through the stomata. Stomatal transpiration is the process through which water is lost through the stomata. As we discussed earlier, stomata present on the leaves. This stomata may be it presents both on the upper side and the lower side of the leaves. This water loss accounts for roughly 80 to 90% of the total water lost from the plant. So next, now again we see here the water molecules are absorbed through the roots and they reach the aerial parts through the stem, branches and leaves, and excess water through the stomata is evaporated into the atmosphere when the stomata are open. Now we see the structure of the stomata. Here The single structure is called a stoma. So this is the opening, and surrounding this stoma there are two cells called as guard cells. In dicots, these two guard cells are kidney shaped, and in case of the monocots, the guard cells are dumbbell shaped. Now we see here this is the typical stomata of the dicots, and this is the typical stomatal structure of the monocot. And stomatal distribution, depending on the stomatal distribution, they are classified into hypostomatous. Particularly in the dicot leaves, we observe the stomatal distribution predominantly occurs on the lower side. So this is called as hypostomatous. We find the stomata mostly on the lower side of the leaves. To prevent the excess transpiration in the dicots, mostly stomata are present on the lower side of the leaves. So it is called as hypostomatous. But in case of the monocots, usually the stomatal distribution is same on the both sides of the leaves. So it is called as amphistomatous. Amphi means both sides of the leaves. And usually in hydrophytes, stomata are absent or degenerated. In the submerged hydrophytes, usually stomata are degenerated because they don't have particular function. So they are called as astomatous. And in case of the nymphia, nilambo, like hydrophytes, stomata are mostly present on the upper side of the leaves. So it is called as epistomatous. And in xerophytes, we find the stomata on the lower side of the leaves, and they are they are also called as sunken stomata. They are deep inside the leaves to prevent the excess loss of water. So they are called as sunken stomata. So hypostomatous, amphistomatous, astomatous, or epistomatous. In case of the some of the Nilambo nymphia hydrophytes, stomata are present on the upper side of the leaves. So they are called as epistomatous. And in submerged hydrophytes, stomata are degenerated. They are called as astomatous. And in xerophytes, we find the sunken stomata. So as we discussed earlier, here we see enlarged picture of the surface of the leaf. See, these two are the guard cells, and this is called stoma. Opening is called as stoma. Stomata is the plural form, and stoma is a singular form. So this opening or stoma is surrounded by two guard cells, and these two guard cells are surrounded by the modified epidermal cells. So these are also called as subsidiary cells. Here we see this is the structure of the guard cell. So usually, as we discussed earlier, in dicots, these two guard cells are kidney shaped. In case of the monocots, these two guard cells are dumbbell shaped. So what is the main function of the stomata? So we see there are two major functions of the stomata. One is the exchange of gases. The major function of the stomata is exchange of gases. So for the photosynthesis, plants need carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide is taken into the leaves for the photosynthesis, and oxygen is released through the stomata into the atmosphere, because usually in photosynthesis carbon dioxide is taken and oxygen is released. So this carbon dioxide is taken into the leaves through the stomata for the photosynthesis, and the oxygen which is evolved through the photosynthesis is released through the stomata. So this is also called as exchange of gases. And one more function is transpiration. That means the excess water is released into the atmosphere in the form of the water vapor through the stomata. So these are the two functions of the stomata. First one is exchange of gases. Second one is transpiration. That is evaporation of the water through the stomata into the outer atmosphere. So now again we see the structure of the stomata here. So now it is in the open form and it is in the closed form. So this is the stomatal pore surrounded by the two guard cells. So when the guard cells in the turgid state, that means when there is plenty of water, it exerts the pressure on the walls. This form is called as turgid state. The swollen state is called as turgid state. In this turgid state, these two guard cells are expanded. Then it leads to the opening of the stomatal pore. And these two guard cells are surrounded by the modified epidermal cells called as subsidiary cells. So now this is the closed form. It appears closed. Usually in the daytime stomata are open and in the nighttime stomata are closed. You see in the structure of the guard cells we can also find the chloroplasts. Apart from the nucleus, we usually in the epidermal cells we don't find the chloroplasts except in the guard cells. So again we see here the opened stomata during the daytime and closed stomata during the night time. So theory of photosynthesis in guard cells. Now we are going to discuss about the different theories proposed regarding the opening and closure mechanism of the stomatal cells. Von Moll observed that stomata open in the light, that means in the daytime. So he proposed the theory called as theory of photosynthesis. As per the Von Moll, stomata open during the daytime and close during the night time. In daytime, chloroplasts, which are present in the guard cells, they form the glucose through the photosynthesis. So glucose is synthesized during the daytime in the guard cells because guard cells contain chloroplasts. Chloroplasts they carry out the photosynthesis during the daytime using the sunlight and they form the glucose. So formation of the glucose in the stomatal cells leads to the osmotic potential, increase in the osmotic potential and then influx of water. That means water enters into the guard cells, the surrounding subsidiary cells. From the subsidiary cells, water enters into the guard cells and they reach the turgid state. Guard cells reach the turgid cell, expanded state. Then they open. Okay. So this is during the daytime. In the night time, the synthesized glucose turns into starch and osmotic potential is decreased. So the excessive water it comes out from the guard cell into the outer subsidiary cells. So it leads to the closure of the stomata. So this is the stomata in open condition, it is in the closed condition. So one more theory called as active potassium pump theory. Active potassium and transport mechanism it is also called. So the concept of potassium ion transport was first given by Fusino, and later it was supported and elaboratedly described by the Levitt and Ruskay in 1975. So opening of stomata depends upon the following conditions. So how the what is the mechanism which leads to the opening of the stomata is described here step by step. So first, the first necessity to open the stomata is presence of light. That means during the daytime, and decrease in starch contents of the God cells. So during the daytime, what happens? Starch is converted into malic acid. So there is a decrease in starch content in the God cells. Next, increased concentration of the malic acid. As we discussed earlier, starch is converted into malic acid. So malic acid content is increased. And next, influx of potassium ions into the God cells. So from through the cell wall, from the surrounding subsidiary cells, potassium ions are transported into the God cell. So this is also called as influx of potassium ions. So from the outer subsidiary cells, potassium ions enter into the God cells. And also efflux of hydrogen ions. That means hydrogen ions, they through the God cells, they come out through the active transport mechanism using ATPase transporter. Hydrogen ions come out of the God cell. This is called as efflux of hydrogen ions. So how the here we see the formation of the hydrogen ions when the malic acid is broken down into hydrogen ions and malate. Hydrogen is the cation and malate is the anion. So this hydrogen ions which are formed by the breakdown of the malic acid, they come out of the God cell through the ATP synthase transporter. And now we see the formation of the malate ions here. So here what happens? We see the accumulation of the ions like malate ion, potassium ion, and also chloride ion. Chloride ions also they come into the God cells to balance the potassium ions. It leads to the opening of the stomata because when there is more accumulation of the ions, it leads to the increase in the osmotic potential. That means decrease in the water potential. Due to the decrease in the water potential from the surrounding subsidiary cells, water enters into the God cell. So this God cell, it it comes to the turgid state, that means expanded state. So stomata opens during the daytime. So this is the mechanism called as active potassium pump theory because potassium ions are the they play the major role in opening of the God cells. So again, lowering of the carbon dioxide concentration is also we can observe because during the daytime the carbon dioxide which is present in the God cells is replaced by the chloroplast for the photosynthesis. So we can also observe the lowering of the carbon dioxide concentration and also high pH, that means more than 7, because we see the efflux of the hydrogen ions, because hydrogen ions they go out of the God cells, and also carbon dioxide content also is reduced. So that means there is more pH. Hydrogen ions play a major role in the acidity, and also carbon dioxide when it is present in the God cells in the soluble form, it forms carbonic acid. So when there is more amount of hydrogen ions and carbon dioxide, it leads to the acidity, that means lowering of the pH. But what happens here? Hydrogen ions they go out of the God cells, and there is a decrease in the content of the carbon dioxide. So pH is increased. These events lead to the opening of the God cells, opening of the stomata. Okay? And now we see the closing of the stomata. What is the mechanism of the closure of the stomata? So it depends on the following conditions. First one is absence of light. So what we observe during the night time, stomata are closed, and decreased concentration of the malic acid in the God cells. As we observed earlier, the starch is converted into malate during the daytime, but in the night time, in reverse, what happens? Malate which is present in the God cells, it come out of the God cells and enter into the subsidiary cells. And also we observe the efflux of the high potassium ions. So in reverse to what happens in the daytime, in the night time, potassium ions they come out of the God cells. This is also called efflux of the potassium ions. And also as the transport of the potassium ions is linked with the chloride ions, they also come out of the God cells. So in reverse to the potassium and chloride ions transport, the transport of the hydrogen ions occur. That means the hydrogen ions enter into the God cells during the night time, which leads to the increase in the acidity. And also we can also observe the increase in the content of the carbon dioxide, because during the night time photosynthesis is stopped. So we can observe the more amount of the carbonic acid and also hydrogen ions, which leads to the lowering of the pH, and finally it leads to the closure of the stomata. So this is the mechanism of the stomatal closure during the night time. So one more theory is proposed by Lloyd, that is also called as starch sugar interconversion theory. So as per Lloyd, the turgidity of God cell depends on interconversion of starch and sugar. So later it was supported by Lockfield. He found out that God cells contain sugar during daytime, which lead to opening of the stomata. So as we discussed earlier, during the daytime, what happens? Photosynthesis takes place. By this photosynthesis, glucose is synthesized. So here he mentioned glucose as the sugar. So sugar is the it is always in the dissolved form. So during the daytime, more amount of sugar or glucose is synthesized through the photosynthesis, which leads to the opening of the stomata. In opposite to this, during the night time, this sugar or glucose is converted into the storage form that is called as starch, that is in the insoluble form. Starch is in the insoluble form. So here the water potential is increased during the night time, so which leads to the stomatal closure. Next, one more hypothesis is Sayer's hypothesis. As per Sayer, the stomata open in neutral or alkaline pH. When there is more pH, stomata open. So during the daytime, due to the constant removal of carbon dioxide by the photosynthesis, stomata remain closed during the night when there is no photosynthesis and due to accumulation of the carbon dioxide. So during the night time, what happened? Carbon dioxide is accumulated in the leaves, in the guard cells. Carbon dioxide is accumulated in the guard cells during the night time because there is no photosynthesis. So the carbon dioxide in the dissolved form, it forms carbonic acid which leads to the lowering of the pH. So stomata are closed. So as per the Sayer hypothesis, when there is more pH, stomata are open. That means in the presence of the alkaline pH, stomata are open, and in the presence of the acidic pH, stomata are closed. And Stewart proposal. Stewart, he proposed the scheme of interconversion of the starch and sugar for the stomatal movement. So he believes that conversion of starch to glucose 1-phosphate is not sufficient and it should be converted to glucose in order to increase in the sufficient osmotic pressure. So as per the Stewart, so what he explained, the total, the conversion mechanism of the starch to the glucose in different steps. In the first step, starch in the presence of the phosphates and phosphorylase enzyme is converted into glucose 1 phosphate. This glucose 1 phosphate is interconverted to glucose 6 phosphate. It is its isomer in the presence of the phosphoglucomutase. And this glucose 6 phosphate, it loses the phosphate in the presence of the phosphatase enzyme. So finally glucose and phosphate are released. Now we see the formation of the glucose, interconversion of the starch to glucose during the daytime, which leads to the opening of the stomata. So here, as we discussed earlier, when there is more amount of the glucose in the leaves, stomata are opened. When there is more amount of the glucose in the guard cells, stomata are opened, which is explained by Stewart in different steps. How the glucose is formed from the starch in different equations. So next, the mechanism of the stomatal closure is described here. During the night time, the glucose which is synthesized during the daytime is converted into glucose 1 phosphate by utilizing the ATP in the presence of the hexokinase enzyme. So during the night time, the reverse mechanism takes place. Glucose is converted into glucose 1 phosphate and this glucose 1 phosphate is converted into starch in the presence of the phosphorylase enzyme. So during the night time, glucose is converted into starch, which leads to the closure of the stomata. So this is the Stewart's proposal. So now we see the different factors which influence the transpiration. Here we find the increase in the temperature here and proportion to the rate of transpiration. How the temperature influences the rate of transpiration. So they are proportional. Both are proportional. When the temperature is increased in proportion to the increase in the temperature, the transpiration also increases. You see, to some extent, this transpiration is keep on increasing with the increase in the temperature. When it reaches certain point, then the transpiration is constant. And also the influence of the wind velocity on transpiration. Here also we observe the rate of transpiration increasing proportion to the wind velocity. When the wind velocity is increased, the transpiration rate also increased. Here we observe the transpiration is increased with the increase in the wind velocity. And effect of humidity on plant transpiration. Here there is a inverse relationship between the humidity and rate of transpiration. As the humidity is increased, the rate of transpiration is decreased. So that's what we observe here. When in the atmosphere there is more humidity, the rate of transpiration is decreased because there is already lot of water is present in the form of the humidity. So there is less difference between that the concentration of water within the leaves and also outside. That means in the atmosphere. There is less gradient. There is less water potential gradient when there is more humidity in the atmosphere. So the rate of transpiration is decreased when the humidity is more in the atmosphere. And finally, we see abscisic acid. What is the role of the abscisic acid? The accumulation of the potassium ions in the guard cell leads to the opening of the stomata. In the many competitive exams, we find this question regarding the potassium ion, the ion which plays major role in the opening of the stomata is potassium. And again, we also observe one more question regarding the abscisic acid, role of abscisic acid in the stomatal closure and opening. So, opposite to the role of the potassium ions, abscisic acid, it inhibits the transpiration by closing the stomata. So, abscisic acid induces the closure of the stomata. So, the presence of abscisic acid, this abscisic acid is a growth inhibiting hormone. It favors the closing of the stomata by blocking uptake of the potassium ions. As we discussed earlier, potassium ions play a major role in the opening of the stomata. So, abscisic acid, it inhibits the transpiration by blocking the uptake of the potassium ions by the guard cells. It also prevents efflux of the hydrogen ions from guard cells. Abscisic acid and carbon dioxide concentration together help in lowering the pH in guard cells. So, as we discussed earlier, when there is more amount of the hydrogen ions and when there is more amount of carbon dioxide, when there is more amount of the abscisic acid, these three lower the pH considerably in the guard cells. So, when the pH is lowered in the guard cells, the stomata are closed. So abscisic acid also acts as the stress hormone during the drought condition. So when there is deficiency of water, when there is scarcity of water, abscisic acid immediately it reaches the leaves. So it is also called as stress hormone. During the water stress, abscisic acid, it is also abbreviated as ABA. It reaches the leaves and it prevents the uptake of the potassium ions into the guard cells and it induces the closure of the stomata. So that is the role of the abscisic acid. Potassium ions promote the opening of the stomata and abscisic acid they promote the closure of the stomata. Adaptations in the desert plants. So usually what we observe in the desert plants, thick cuticle, reduced leaf areas, sunken stomata and hairs on the surface of the leaves of the desert plants. These are also called as xerophytes. In xerophytes, there are specific adaptations to prevent the water loss. This is also called transpiration. So, xerophytes cannot afford the loss of water because there is no availability of water for the xerophytes. To adapt to the xerophytic conditions, leaves have the thick cuticles on the surface. This thick cuticle prevents the water loss and also reduced leaf areas. Usually in xerophytes we find the smaller leaves or we can see some of the modifications in the leaves like mostly leaves are modified as spines. For example, opentia. In opentia what we observe, the leaves are totally modified as the spines and stem there it is adapted into the cladophyle and it carries out the photosynthesis. So to prevent the transpiration in the xerophytes like opentia, leaves are totally modified as the spines. And in some of the plants like asparagus, leaves are modified as scales. And also we observe the sunken stomata. This is the one of the major feature of the xerophytes. Stomata are restricted to the lower epidermis of the leaves and these stomata are in the form of the sunken stomata. They are located deep inside the lower epidermis. Stomata are located deep inside. So this is called as sunken stomata. And also these stomata are surrounded by the hairs to prevent the excess transpiration. So they make sure that xerophytes make sure that there is least amount of the transpiration. So it is prerequisite. Opening of the stomata is prerequisite for the survival of the plants because plants need carbon dioxide for the photosynthesis which enters into the leaves through the stomata. So to carry out the photosynthesis, plants need carbon dioxide which must enter through the stomata when they open. So, opening of the stomata is a prerequisite for the plants. And many desert plants have a special type of the photosynthesis. So, to minimize the water loss or to minimize the transpiration, these desert plants are the xerophytes. They have specific mechanism, particularly in the succulents. We observe this mechanism. It is also called crassulation acid metabolism or CAM metabolism. So here what happens In the crustaceous plants, stomata open in the night time and they are closed in the daytime. These are also called as photoactive stomata. Okay. Here, what happened? Stomata open during the night time, so carbon dioxide is taken in the night time. This carbon dioxide, which is taken during the night time, is utilized in the daytime. So this is the specific mechanism. It is called as CAM mechanism. And now we see SPAC. What is SPAC? The transpiration is the process of water movement through a plant and its evaporation from the aerial parts such as leaves, stems and flowers. As we discussed earlier, the water is taken through the roots into the plants. This water is utilized by the plants in the different metabolic reactions like photosynthesis, and 90% of the water is evaporated through the leaves which enters into the atmosphere. So this is like a cycle. Through the soil, water enters into the plants, and through the plants, water enters into the atmosphere in the form of the vapors, water vapor. And this cycle is called as soil, plant, atmosphere continuum. Okay, thank you.